Yara Greyjoy stood at the prow of the Silence, the crisp night air slashing against her cheeks as the ship cut through the icy waters. No moon hung in the sky to show the way, only a shroud of stars that glimmered faintly overhead, scattered like shards of broken glass across an obsidian canvas. The wind sighed in her ears, carrying the scent of salt and death. She sensed the familiar tang of the sea, but underlying that was a stinging bitterness, something even colder than the night itself, a warning that she now sailed beyond the realm of mortal men. She gripped the rail, her gloved hand curling tight, knuckles whitening beneath the leather. Ahead lay the edge of the known world, and beyond it, an alliance that would break every oath she had once sworn to herself. She had always prided herself on loyalty to family and crew, on never bending the knee to outsiders, but she could no longer rely on the battered Iron Fleet or the fractured houses of Westeros to give her what she desired most: the resurrection of her people's power and the vengeance she craved against all who had dismissed the Iron Islands as a mere nuisance. A piece of her heart still clenched at the memory of her father's murder, at the betrayal woven into the web of her uncle's ambitions. Yet for all her anger, she had never anticipated that her journey would lead her to the far north, to the cold domain of the dead. She had heard the tales like everyone else. The Night King marched south with an army of whites and white walkers, unstoppable and as frigid as the heart of winter itself. But while Jon Snow and the Targaryen queen to the east floundered, uncertain how to unite the fractured kingdoms, Yara had seized upon a different course. The sea was life to the Ironborn, the salted waves that mothered them and promised them glory. But in these new days, the sea was threatened by the creeping frost, by an enemy who commanded the raw force of ice. If the seas froze, the Iron Islands would choke. Their ships would be worthless, their raiding ways useless. She could not allow that unless she found a way to twist it to her advantage. For what was an Ironborn if not relentless, unafraid to steal victory from the jaws of certain defeat? Yara had chosen to risk everything for a single gamble, to treat with the Night King himself. Some called it madness, an act that would brand her a traitor to the living. But she believed in power above all else, and she told herself that she would wrest a bargain from the great other's champion or die trying. The Silence glided through black waters glinting in the starlight, the crew subdued by a collective sense of dread. They were Ironborn, true, but not even the hardest among them were immune to the unnatural hush that lay across the sea. This was not the quiet of an ordinary night. It was a silence that stretched into the marrow, as though even the waves dared not offend the stillness. Once or twice, Yara caught glimpses of ice floes drifting in the distance, their edges lit silver by the faint glow of the sky. Occasional cracking noises echoed across the water, an uncanny staccato that set every man's nerves on edge. Yet despite their unease, not one dared speak in protest of her course. She had led them across countless raids. She was Yara Greyjoy, the Iron Daughter, and her command was absolute. If any man disliked the madness of traveling deeper into the domain of the undead, he kept it to himself. Fear bred obedience as surely as respect did among the Ironborn. Dark rumors had trickled down from the north, carried by ravens with messages that men scoffed at until the wall was destroyed. The living had watched in horror as the fabled wall came crashing down, shattered by the unstoppable force of a resurrected dragon. That alone had ignited nightmares across the Seven Kingdoms. But to Yara, it was proof that the enemy's power was boundless, and that she had to make a choice. Fight with the living, who had never truly accepted her or her kin. Join forces with Daenerys Targaryen, who might demand a subservience no Ironborn could countenance for long. Or try something even more audacious. Ally with the Great Other who threatened to plunge the world into eternal winter. It was not as if she had illusions of mercy from this frozen king. But if she could approach him as a partner rather than a foe, perhaps she could ensure the survival of her people under whatever new order rose from the snows. Somewhere far behind her, she knew Theon wrestled with his own ghosts. She had left him in the south, unable to drag him along on this mission, uncertain whether he had the fortitude to face the horrors they might encounter. Though she loved her brother, she had also accepted that his spirit was fragile, still mending from Ramsay's atrocities. Better that he remain behind, perhaps to rally the rest of their scattered kin or pledge them to Daenerys for the time being. She herself had set out with only her most loyal men, veterans who had withstood storms and battles, who had gazed into the eyes of sea monsters and men alike. Yet all that was mortal. Against the chilling might of the undead, would any of it matter? This question she kept buried inside, letting her outward visage remain stern and unshakable. She could not afford to show fear. Ironborn, do not kneel. Ironborn, do not quiver. She instructed her helmsman to steer them ever northward, watching the waters carefully for signs of ice thickening. Each day, the temperature dropped further, and the patches of ice that drifted on the waves grew in size. The men slept in cloaks and furs, cursing the frosty air that bit at their faces. Yet no matter how cold it grew, their determination to follow her never broke. The horizon stretched emptily before them, that infinite midnight sky blending with the black water until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. It felt like sailing through an endless void, as though they had stepped outside of time. Days bled into nights of restless half-sleep. The men saw strange shapes flickering across the waves and sometimes whispered of hearing voices carried by the wind, voices that chanted in no human tongue. Yara herself slept rarely. She prowled the deck in a silent vigil, eyes scanning the darkness, searching for some impossible sign of the being she had come to find. She had no plan for how to reach out to the Night King, no message, no parley. She could only hope that if his power stretched across the sea, he might sense the presence of a fearless soul drawing near. If that was naive, so be it, but a true Ironborn risked all or died in pursuit of what they wanted. One bitter morning, Yara awoke in her cabin to find the silence no longer rocking upon the waves. Instead, everything was still. The sense of motion vanished. Alarmed, she grabbed her weapons, strapped on her dagger and short sword, then stepped outside to discover that the entire sea around them had frozen into a glass-like field of ice. It was not just a rim of frost. The water had turned solid from horizon to horizon, locking the silence in place as though it were caught in the jaws of a giant creature. Men stood in uneasy clusters on the deck, some peering over the side with wide eyes, others prodding at the ice with spears to test its thickness. Frigid gusts swept over them, stinging exposed skin like needles. The sails drooped motionless, helpless in a world with no wind or wave. Yara pressed her lips together and strode to the side. Staring over the rail, she saw a crystal expanse that shimmered. Beneath the surface, the shadows of frozen creatures could be glimpsed, fish, or so it seemed, trapped in perpetual motion, their final movements suspended in that watery tomb. A hush lay upon them that reminded her of the quiet within a grave. She felt a surge of dread but forced her voice to stay steady. "We're going overboard," she announced, glancing at her most trusted men. "We'll see if it holds our weight. There must be reason to this. The current can't carry us farther, so we'll walk." The order sounded mad, but as she locked eyes with each of her crew, they bowed their heads. They were Ironborn. They had stood by her in storms and wars. They would not fail her now. Axes chopped away at the hull where it bit into the ice, allowing them to lower a makeshift ramp. Yara descended first, each step filled with tension as she tested the ice beneath her boots. It was indeed thick enough to bear the weight of several men in full gear. The world seemed eerily silent. Even the cracking echoes had vanished. She felt as though she had entered an otherworldly domain, a place where time itself was trapped in a moment of lifeless chill. She gestured for the others to follow, and one by one, the Ironborn came onto the ice, forming a ragged line behind their leader. They walked for hours without direction or signs of life. The cold turned their breaths into clouds, their eyelashes crusted with frost. Some men clutched their chests, struggling against the deep freeze settling into their bones. Still, Yara pressed on, convinced that the very presence of this magical freeze had to be a sign. The Night King was near, or at least his influence was. The stillness was not merely the absence of wind. It was an unearthly force that had cut the world off from the realm of the living. Yara's heartbeat pulsed in her temples. Each crunching footstep on the ice sounded sacrilegious, as if they trod upon sacred ground belonging to a god of death. Once or twice, she thought she saw shapes in the distance, tall, gaunt figures drifting along the horizon. Each time, she halted to peer more closely, and the shapes evaporated like mist. When at last the faint glow of dusk arrived, it brought a flicker of color to the endless white and gray. The sky blazed momentarily with a purple hue as the sun tried to penetrate the thick cloud cover. Then it vanished again, swallowed by the same bleak hush. In that half-light, the Ironborn came upon something that made them gasp. A field of broken ships, their hulls and sails crusted with ice, littering the frozen sea as far as the eye could see. They must have been caught in the freeze and crushed by the unstoppable expansion of ice. Masts jutted at odd angles, sails torn and rigid. The entire scene looked like a graveyard of the sea's lost children. Yara's eyes passed over the wrecks, her throat tightening at the sight. She recognized some banners, though they were unrecognizable beneath the frost. Merchant vessels, fishing boats, possibly war galleys from distant lands. All of them had become silent tombs. If they were not careful, the silence would join them. They traversed the labyrinth of broken ships, searching for anything of use, supplies, a clue. Men pried open hatches and found nothing but death below deck. Half-frozen corpses with hands still clutching at the last vestiges of warmth. Some had hammered at the ceilings in desperate attempts to escape. Others looked like they had simply gone to sleep and never awoke. The stench was muted by the cold, but the sight of so many lifeless forms made even the Ironborn uneasy. It was as if the sea had rebelled against all seafarers, punishing them by yanking them under an icy domain. Yara's mind churned with the question. Why was she allowed to walk here still breathing? Why had her ship stopped but not been crushed? She sensed a guiding hand in all of this, some monstrous intelligence orchestrating their path. She pressed on, determined to find its source. At last, as dusk threatened to slip into another cold night, they climbed onto the battered deck of a caravel that lay capsized on its side. From its vantage, they could survey the horizon for miles. Yara narrowed her eyes, scanning the expanse of shimmering ice, and her heart skipped when she glimpsed a dark shape in the distance. It looked like a cluster of towering black spires stabbing upward. It almost resembled a fortress or an island. Impossible that there would be a fortress out here, she thought, unless it was conjured by powers beyond mortal comprehension. Wordlessly, she pointed, and her men followed her gaze. No one spoke. A ripple of fear passed among them, but so did a glimmer of purpose. If there was a chance this black fortress was where the Night King dwelled, if such a being could dwell anywhere, then that was where they had to go. They marched again, pushing through the biting cold, as the light faded until only the pale glimmer of distant stars lit their way. The black fortress grew nearer, rising from the ice like a nightmare. Its walls were not hewn stone in the manner of mortal castles, but rather columns of glacial ice, swirling with trapped darkness, shapes that seemed to move within as though alive. Massive, jagged parapets crowned its top, glistening under the faint starlight. The entire structure emanated a cold so intense that Yara's lungs burned with each breath. She willed herself to remain calm, stepping into the colossal shadow cast by the fortress. She could feel no wind. Even the slightest breeze that had accompanied them died here, leaving the air dead still, thick with the hush of the grave. An archway, big enough for a giant to pass through, yawned open before them. It was carved, if carved was the word, into the face of the ice, and from within the fortress came a bluish glow, flickering, ephemeral. Yara raised a hand, halting her men. She saw their eyes, full of uncertainty. "Stay close," she whispered, though the hush of the place made her voice echo. "We go together." She took the lead, shoulders squared, and crossed the threshold into the fortress of ice. The corridor beyond was lit by a ghostly luminescence that clung to the walls, revealing twisting patterns like ancient runes. The floor was slick, yet she managed to keep her footing. Her crew followed, their breath puffing in clouds that trailed behind them. Not a single sound came from within, neither the dripping of water nor the howling of wind. Everything was as still as a tomb, They passed through a hall that seemed to stretch impossibly far. Now and again, they glimpsed side passages, winding tunnels that vanished into blackness. The entire place was labyrinthine, a warren of frozen corridors that defied rational architecture. More than once, the men muttered that they felt as if the corridors changed behind them. If they turned back, they might never find their way out. Yara clenched her teeth and forced herself to press forward. She could not falter now. She had come here for a purpose, to forge an alliance or die in the attempt. At length, they entered an enormous chamber, shaped like a vast cathedral. Towering pillars of ice soared to meet a domed ceiling so high that it seemed to vanish in the gloom. An eerie phosphorescence lit the space, casting dancing shadows that slid across the walls like living things. A dais rose at the far end, carved out of the same swirling black ice. Atop it stood a figure, tall, impossibly still, wreathed in a silence so profound it seemed to press against the mind. The figure's skin was a pale, bluish white, almost translucent, and where its eyes should have been, twin glimmers of icy blue stared out. The horns of its crown merged with the ridges of its skull, making it both regal and monstrous. He stood with the detachment of a being that did not need to breathe, did not feel warmth or cold, did not recognize the constraints of mortality. The Night King. Yara exhaled slowly. She felt the primal urge to drop to her knees or run screaming, but she forced herself to remain upright. This was just a creature, she told herself, albeit an ancient and powerful one. She set her jaw and advanced, each footstep echoing on the frost-laden floor. Her men followed behind her, but their courage wavered. She sensed their tension, sensed that any sudden movement by this entity could send them fleeing or attacking in blind panic. Yet the Night King did not move. He watched them ascend the dais, that azure gaze locked on Yara's face. At last, she stood but a handful of paces from him. Her breath shook. 1,000 frantic thoughts raced through her mind. How did one address an enemy of the living? How did one propose an alliance to a being who communicated only in deathly whispers and gestures? She clenched her hands. "I am Yara Greyjoy," she said, her voice echoing. It felt strange to speak in that stillness, as if her words were foreign intrusions. "I come from the Iron Islands, seeking a pact with the one who commands ice and death." She paused, uncertain if she should continue or if he even understood her speech. The Night King tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible motion. For a moment, she heard nothing but the hammering of her own heart. Then a gust of air seemed to swirl through the chamber, though it came from nowhere visible. Her men stirred behind her, hands instinctively reaching for weapons. Yara gestured for them to hold. The Night King lifted one pale hand. In that gesture, there was neither threat nor welcome, but an acknowledgement. A hush deeper than before settled, as though all the realm outside ceased to exist. Then, with that hand, he pointed toward Yara's chest. His icy gaze pinned her in place, and she felt a coldness seep through her entire body, as if winter itself were pouring into her veins. She saw nothing else, only those inhuman eyes, those eyes that held the memory of every winter since the long night. In that moment, she perceived flickers of images, half-formed visions of armies of the dead marching across fields of ice, of dragons turned into living frost, of the downfall of kings and queens. Above all, she sensed the unstoppable inevitability of the Night King's purpose, to extinguish the warm life of men and remake the world in his own frigid image. Yet, in the swirl of that revelation, she caught a glimpse of something else. The sea, frozen from horizon to horizon, a boundless plain of ice upon which ships lay like broken toys. And in the center of that field of ice, a lone figure that resembled her, crowned in frost, guiding legions of undead across the water. She staggered, chest tight. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come. The Night King lowered his hand, and the chamber was once again only a cathedral of ice. But something had changed. When she looked at him, she felt that a bargain had been silently proposed. Serve him, or be devoured by the cold that he wielded. Her voice came out strained. "You want the seas. They're yours. If we can freeze them, The Iron Fleet can bring your armies anywhere. The living believe their waters protect them, that their ships and alliances can keep you at bay. But the Ironborn know how to strike fear into men, to cross the waters as reavers, raiders. If we do this, we can bring them all to their knees. In return, her gaze flicked to her loyal men. She forced herself to stand a little straighter, to gather the last of her nerve. In return, I want the Iron Islands. I want my people to endure in your new world. I want them to rule the salted expanses that freeze beneath your power. Let us be your armada on the black seas of your kingdom. His head moved with an uncanny grace, as though weighing her words in a manner beyond human logic. A chill snaked through Yara's heart as she realized she was effectively bargaining with the end of the world. There would be no going back from this. She would be remembered, if memories persisted, either as the one who brought doom upon Westeros or as the mother of a new era for the Ironborn. She tried to swallow, but her throat was too dry. She almost expected the Night King to speak, but he only shifted that terrible ancient gaze. She felt his power royal in the air around them, thrumming like the heartbeat of a monster. Then his hand rose again, a single finger pointing toward a wall of the chamber. The ice twisted there, forming a shape, and within that shape she saw what looked like the silhouette of a man with the Greyjoy kraken stitched upon his cloak, raising a sword that glowed with some unearthly fire. She didn't recognize it, but the intention felt clear, a final test or prophecy. The shape vanished as quickly as it had formed, leaving only the swirl of darkness in the ice. Without a word, the Night King turned and strode deeper into the fortress, his steps so silent he seemed to hover. Yara stood, stunned. She glanced at her men, who looked to her for guidance. Reluctantly, she followed him, descending into a deeper corridor that spiraled downward. The walls here were even more hypnotic, swirling with shapes that half resembled faces, twisted in expressions of torment or ecstasy. She could not decide. On and on they went, the only sound the crunch of boots on the thin layer of frost. The temperature dropped even further, to the point where each breath threatened to freeze in her lungs. Yet the presence of the Night King guided them, preventing them from simply collapsing. Whether that was benevolence or a demonstration of control, she could not say. At last they emerged into a wide cavern that might have been directly beneath the fortress. In its center roiled a pool of dark water, unfrozen but shimmering with flecks of blue light. Steam, or some unearthly vapor, rose from its surface, coiling in lazy tendrils. The Night King approached the edge of the pool, placed one hand upon its surface, and the water hissed as it turned instantly to a layer of ice. Then, as if to prove his dominion, he drew his hand away, and the ice cracked, allowing the water to flow once more. It was a demonstration of raw power. Yara stood at his side, her men behind her. She swallowed hard, unknowing what came next. The Night King reached out, grasped her wrist in an iron grip, and pressed her palm to the water's surface. A shock of cold nearly made her scream. It was like grabbing a handful of snow that burned like fire. But beneath the physical sensation, she felt the presence of an unimaginable power winding up her arm, burrowing into her flesh and soul. Images flared behind her eyes. Storms at sea, waves turning to jagged ice, ships locked in place, men drowning beneath frozen tides, the silent march of whites across shattered harbors, entire coastlines encased in unbreakable frost. Interwoven with these visions, she saw the Ironborn standing at the Night King's side, unstoppable, carrying his banners across the realms by sea. It was horrifying and exhilarating all at once. When he released her, she stumbled back, gasping. Frost rimed her glove and forearm, a spiderweb of ice that glistened in the chamber's eerie light. Her men rushed forward, but she waved them away. The frost spread, creeping up her shoulder, and she let out a ragged cry, summoning all her will to keep moving, to keep her blood from freezing in her veins. Slowly, painstakingly, she felt the cold recede, not gone but retreating beneath her skin, as though it had found a host and settled in. She let out a shuddering breath. In that moment, she knew she had become something neither fully living nor truly dead, marked by the Night King's power. There was no turning back. The fortress was silent as they emerged from the depths. The Night King escorted them back to the Great Hall, but now the walls thrummed with a deeper resonance, as though the entire place recognized her presence. She had been changed. Her men tried not to stare, but she saw the alarm in their eyes. Only a few hours prior, she had been their captain, their fearless leader. Now they sensed a weirdness in her, something like the chill of the grave. She clenched her jaw, reminding herself that this was the price of power. Without ceremony, the Night King led them to an archway that opened onto the sea. Yara blinked against a new swirl of snow that whipped past them. Sometime during their sojourn in the fortress, a storm had swept in, blotting out the stars. The wind howled across the ice, swirling flurries in a dance of white. Where the silence had lain locked in place, Yara now beheld an entire black ocean stilled into a new glacier. Yet within that glacier, shapes moved, figures that walked across the surface hundreds upon hundreds, an entire legion of the dead. Their eyes glowed with that same icy light, and their pale hands clutched spears, swords, axes, each a relic of the realms of men. The Night King stepped onto the ice, paying no heed to the storm. Yara followed, her cloak snapping in the wind. Her men formed a wary semicircle behind her. She looked out at this dreaded host, an army large enough to overrun kingdoms. The knowledge that she had willingly placed herself at its head was dizzying. Yet she remembered the day she watched the Iron Island's influence shrink, the day her father fell, the day her uncle usurped her birthright. She remembered the scorn with which the lords of the mainland treated the Ironborn. Now they would see what it meant to defy Yara Greyjoy. The cold stung her cheeks, but she managed a grim smile. This was her moment. She raised an arm and pointed toward her ship. By some dark miracle, the silence remained intact, though its masts were thickly coated in frost. The hull groaned under the weight. She could see the faint silhouettes of the crew members who had remained on board, arms flailing as they tried to break free of the ice that imprisoned them. She took a few steps forward, each step echoing across the frozen sea, and her men followed. At the base of the fortress, the Night King stood unmoving, just watching. "We set sail," Yara shouted into the wind, though it was an absurd thing to say when the water was frozen. The men glanced at one another. "We came here seeking a bargain," she continued. "Now we have it. Come." She gestured impatiently. "We cannot remain here." Some of the whites began to move, forming ranks behind her men as though drawn by her presence. Yara felt her spine prickle. The living Ironborn found themselves flanked by the dead, a vantage no mortal had ever willingly chosen. Yet no one raised a weapon, for there was an eerie sense of unity. She led them across the ice to the silence. It took hours to hack the ship free from the encroaching ice, hours during which the undead legion stood motionless, as though waiting for some silent command. Finally, as a thunderous crack reverberated across the frozen sea, the silence bobbed upward. The ice parted in an almost deliberate line. A channel formed, as if an unseen hand had drawn a path for them. Her men cast glances at one another. A mixture of awe and horror warred in their faces. But Yara stood at the helm, her hair whipping around her face, and guided her vessel forward. She ordered sails to be raised, though the wind was faint and swirling. In response, as if the Night King willed it, a cold gale arose, pushing them forward. The silence began its slow progress across the newly frozen expanse, accompanied by that undead legion marching in perfect unison, never tiring, never breaking ranks. For the first time, Yara fully grasped the scale of what she had unleashed. She watched as whites poured across the ice on either side of her ship, forging a path that led south. Anywhere they met open water, the slightest touch of the Night King's power froze it solid, bridging the gap. In days, that unstoppable wave of winter would cross into territory believed safe from invasion by sea. Ports would be encased in ice. Harbors would shatter under the cold's relentless expansion. Yet the silence sailed unimpeded, cutting through waters that parted beneath the will of her new master. The deck was filled with living men eyeing the undead that climbed aboard. Some whites manned the rigging, their hands deft and sure despite their rotting flesh. Others gathered below decks. Yara inhaled sharply, working to contain her revulsion. This was the alliance she'd chosen. She told herself it was for the Ironborn, for their freedom from the shackles of all these southern lords who had never respected them. Still, a whisper of doubt gnawed at the back of her mind. 2 nights later, they reached the outskirts of a small port town on the northern coast. Once, it might have been a thriving fishing village. Now, it lay deserted, the inhabitants fled or dead. The silence glided in over water that had not quite frozen. Behind them, the white swirl of the undead host spread across the horizon like a storm cloud. Yara ordered the men to drop anchor, though she suspected the line might freeze the moment it touched the water. She disembarked with a handful of her people, venturing ashore in the icy gloom. Buildings stood half-collapsed, as if ravaged by earlier skirmishes. No living soul greeted them, only silent streets. Snow blanketed rooftops and drifted against walls. She wondered if any watchers hid behind shuttered windows, trembling in fear. If they did, they were wise to remain hidden. She gazed upon the empty settlement and felt no triumph. It was as if the land was already claimed by winter's hush. Behind her, the whites formed ranks along the shoreline, eyes aglow. No one gave a verbal order, but they knew their purpose. She realized that every fortress and village along the coast would soon meet this fate. An unstoppable surge of cold, captained by Yara Greyjoy, the traitor to the living. The knowledge made her stomach churn. Ironborn do not balk at violence, she reminded herself. We do not fear raids or war. But this was something else, an all-consuming wave that erased life altogether. That night, the Night King himself arrived on an undead steed at the edge of the town. Snow whipped around him, swirling like a cloak. His posture was regal and terrifying. Yara approached, forcing herself not to tremble. There were no words exchanged. His presence alone was a commanding force. He lifted an arm, pointing south, and she understood. They were to continue down the coast, freezing every harbor and stamping out all resistance. She bowed her head, acknowledging his command, and then watched as he rode away, the legion of whites at his back. Though she was allied with him, she felt as though she were merely a piece on his board, another tool in his grand design. In the days that followed, the sea froze for leagues around the coasts of the north. With the silence at its forefront, the Ironborn found themselves in a position of unparalleled dominance, yet also horrifying servitude. Towns fell without a struggle as the undead host poured in. Harbor chains snapped when faced with the relentless siege of ice. The silent whites pressed forward, unstoppable, while Yara's living crew shadowed them, reaping supplies, salvage, and any spoils that might be gleaned. Some men grew uneasy, whispering that they had bartered away their souls. Others reveled in the unstoppable violence, claiming the Ironborn had finally found a force that would let them pillage all of Westeros without check. One evening, Yara stood alone on the deck of the Silence, gazing at the horizon. The frigid wind cut her face, and she watched the swirling storm clouds blot out the sunset. She thought of Theon and wondered if he still lived. If so, he would hear the tales soon enough. Yara Greyjoy had allied with the enemy of life, bringing winter's wrath to every shore. Would he curse her name? Would he try to stop her? She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling for the frost that still lay beneath her skin. That numb chill was a constant reminder of her new bond, a bond that transcended language. She could sense the Night King's presence anywhere, like a looming shadow in the back of her mind, guiding her steps. Gulltown was the first major city to fall to her new alliance. Ice formed in the Bay of the Crabs, sinking or immobilizing every ship in the harbor. Her whites marched over the floes and into the city gates. Though the Vale's knights tried to muster a defense, they were ill-prepared for a naval assault that came on foot over a frozen bay. Word of the city's downfall spread quickly, sowing panic among the southern lords. The unstoppable northern plague had found a way around natural barriers. If the seas themselves were no protection, where could one hide? Yara paced the captured ramparts of Gulltown's harbor fortifications, overseeing the consolidation of power. The living Ironborn within her ranks set about collecting grain and other supplies. Meanwhile, the Whites stood like statues, awaiting the next command. She had rarely felt so powerful, yet never so uneasy. This was not the victory she had once dreamed of. She had not merely bested her enemies. She had unleashed an existential threat upon a world that could scarcely defend itself. It wasn't long before ravens from the south arrived, though their messages contained nothing but desperate pleas and accusations of treachery. She burned them unread, refusing to engage. What could she say? That she had grown tired of being a minor player on a grand stage of kings and queens? That she'd chosen to side with the unstoppable because she refused to be ground under the heel of false promises? None of that would matter to those who now watched entire coastlines freeze under the Night King's dominion. She retreated to her quarters that night, searching for a moment's peace, but found none. Even in the small cabin within Gulltown's keep, the chill was pervasive. Frost crawled along the walls, creeping in delicate patterns. She lit a brazier, but the fire did little to banish the cold. Outside, an otherworldly glow illuminated the streets where the undead stood sentinel. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by half-lucid visions of a ruined Westeros. At times she saw herself on a throne of black ice, crowned by the Night King's hand, and felt revulsion warring with twisted pride. At other times she dreamed of the sea as it used to be, wild and free and alive, before she had allowed it to be silenced. At dawn, she ordered the silence readied. The next stop was the Vale's coastline, beyond the Bloody Gate. She meant to drive the wedge of winter deeper into Westeros, fulfilling her side of the bargain. As the men set sail, or rather glided along patches of water that periodically froze and thawed at the command of the Night King, Yara climbed to the prow, ignoring the stares of her crew. They feared her now. Perhaps they should. An Ironborn blessed and cursed by the power of the Great Other was something outside their traditions. Snow fell steadily as they pushed forward, the avalanche of winter unstoppable. In every port they found deserted streets, locked gates, or small pockets of resistance that crumbled under the combined might of the living Ironborn and the dead. It was not a war so much as a slow, methodical extinguishing of light and heat. Day by day, the freeze spread, creeping its way around the eastern shores of Westeros, inching toward the Crownlands. By the time they neared Crackclaw Point, rumors reached them that King's Landing itself was in a state of chaos. Refugees poured in from the countryside, fleeing the unstoppable tide of white. The Crown's ships, commanded by whatever forces Cersei had left behind, if Cersei still lived, tried to mount a defense. Yara smirked grimly at the thought. The Lannisters had always been proud, yet a naval blockade against an army that marched over frozen seas was laughable. She almost pitied them. Almost. One night, as the silence anchored off a small cove near Maidenpool, Yara gazed out over the quietly lapping water. The freeze had not yet solidified this region, but she saw the ice creeping in from the horizon, unstoppable. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, granting only the faintest glimmer of illumination. The ship's lanterns swayed in the breeze. Her men muttered to each other in low voices, uneasy about the next stage of the campaign. Yara stood near the rail, that old habit returning whenever she needed to think. The visions that had haunted her since the Fortress of Ice still plagued her. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt the presence of the Night King, as if his will was pressing gently on her mind, urging her forward. "What have I done?" she whispered, her words swallowed by the darkness. She had succeeded in forging an alliance beyond any mortal measure, but at what cost? She had wanted power for the Ironborn. She had wanted vengeance for the disrespect shown to her people. Yet the scale of destruction she witnessed was far beyond grieving. This was an apocalypse rolling slowly south, unstoppable, unyielding. She tried to tell herself the outcome was inevitable. If not by her hand, then by the Night King's alone. At least this way she might carve out a place for the Ironborn in the New World. But that rationalization rang hollow now that she saw the suffering etched in the faces of those they captured. Mothers clutching children, old men too weak to flee, young knights trying to hold the line. They weren't all Lannisters or Baratheons or any of the great houses that had spurned her. Many were just ordinary folk with no stake in the great game. She gripped the rail harder, frustration welling in her. Wasn't this exactly what the Ironborn had always done? Pillage the weak? Hadn't she been raised on the principle that we do not so meant taking what they needed from those who could not stop them? Why, then, did her conscience plague her now? Perhaps it was Theon's influence, or the memory of her father's madness, or simply the sheer horror of the undead. She shook her head. She had no easy answers. A soft footstep alerted her that one of her men approached. It was Harl, a lean raider with a weathered face who'd followed her since her earliest voyages. He spoke in a low rumble, mindful not to be overheard by too many. "Captain," he said, using the old title they'd always called her. "We've had word from the scouts ashore. The Targaryen queen, Daenerys. She's retreated south with her armies, but a smaller force is rumored to be in the area, led by the Stark bastard. Some say he's forging alliances to stand against the dead." Yara turned, her gaze sharp. "Jon Snow." "Aye." Harl scratched at his beard, snow clinging to the tufts. "He might be in Maidenpool itself. Word is he's rallying what troops he can. There's talk of a last stand, though you know how rumors blow in the wind. They say he has a pack of northern men, a few knights from the Riverlands, and a handful of others. Our outriders haven't confirmed anything yet." She stared at him, thinking back to the early days when she'd considered allying with Jon Snow. He had seemed an honorable sort, albeit naive in her eyes. "If he's there, he'll be trying to stem the tide," she said. "He might attempt to reason with me, or to kill me." She noted Harl's uneasy glance. "We'll handle it," she added curtly. Yet inside, she couldn't ignore a flicker of guilt. Jon Snow was trying to save the living. She was actively working for the dead. Later that night, Yara led a small detachment ashore, leaving a skeleton crew aboard the Silence. She carried a sword at her hip and a dagger strapped to her thigh. Her breath plumed white in the winter air. Snow fell steadily, muffling their footsteps as they moved toward Maidenpool's outskirts. The horizon behind them glowed with a faint blue light where the undead horde advanced, mile by mile. The living had little time left. Maidenpool's walls were not especially tall or formidable, but the gates stood closed, and the ramparts were manned by men with torches. Yara halted at a distance, scanning the defenses. She wondered if Jon Snow truly hid within. How would he react if she presented herself? Her men suggested scaling a weaker portion of the wall, but she ordered them to hold. Something in her gut told her to try a different approach. With a torch held high, she strode forward alone, hands raised to show she meant no immediate harm. A cry sounded from the ramparts, and bows appeared above. "State your name and purpose," a guard called. His voice shook, yet it was firm enough. She cleared her throat. "Yara Greyjoy. I've come to speak with Jon Snow if he's within. I want no quarrel." A silence followed. The men on the wall exchanged uncertain glances. Then, to her astonishment, a voice she did recognize rang out. "Open the gate. I'll speak to her." She exhaled slowly. It was Jon. The gates creaked open just enough for Yara to slip through. Inside, she found herself in a courtyard dusted with snow, fires burning in braziers for warmth. A small group of men waited, armed, cautious. At their head stood Jon Snow, looking weary and frostbitten, cloaked in thick furs. His hair was matted with melting flakes, and his dark eyes regarded her with a sorrowful intensity. There was no sign of dragons or larger armies. She saw perhaps a few dozen men, enough to guard the walls, but no match for the tide of death soon to come. "Yara," he said quietly, stepping forward. He spared a glance at her men, who waited outside the gate. "What in the seven hells are you doing? You're with them." There was no accusation in his tone, more heartbreak. She tried not to flinch. "I made a deal," she said, voice rough. "The Iron Islands have no future in a world broken by the wars of the Southern Lords. We needed power. We needed—" She trailed off, unable to express all her anger, her bitterness. You saw what was coming, Jon. You tried to warn them all, to unite them. They wouldn't listen. So I found another way. Jon's gaze flicked to the faint glow on the horizon, that same eerie luminescence of the undead host. He clenched his jaw. This is no alternative, Yara. You've enslaved yourself, your entire people, to a force that wants nothing but the end of life. It won't spare the Ironborn. It won't spare anyone. He took a few steps closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. It'll use you, then destroy you. She shook her head, frustration bursting forth. I've seen its power, Jon. If I refused, the Ironborn would be the first to drown under the new winter. At least this way there's a chance. She stopped, noticing the flicker of pity in his eyes. Don't look at me like that. You always thought I was a savage islander. Now here I am, forging the only alliance that matters, while you scramble to hold a worthless town. Jon exhaled, his breath swirling in front of him. You don't have to do this, he said gently. You can help us fight back. You know how to sail, how to raid. We need your skill, your courage. His voice faltered. We still have a chance if we stand together. She laughed, the sound harsh in the frigid air. A chance? Against that. She gestured toward the night. You have no idea the power I've seen. The seas themselves freeze at his command. Entire fleets lie shattered. You can gather every night in Westeros, and it won't matter. The dead will march over your corpses. She knew her words were vicious, but she couldn't help it. Jon's face hardened with resolve, that same stubbornness that had led him beyond the wall, that had brought him to ally with the wildlings. I'd rather die free than bow to that demon, he said quietly. And so would most in this realm. If that means we make our last stand here, so be it. But you could help us. You could rally the Ironborn who remain uncorrupted. She opened her mouth to retort but stopped short. Something inside her twisted at the mention of her people. She remembered her loyal men, so many of whom now shared her uncertain fate. She remembered Theon, who had tried, in his broken way, to find redemption. Would he too prefer death to this half-existence? A distant horn call shattered the moment. Jon's men stiffened. The watchers on the walls cried out. A cold wind swept through the courtyard, extinguishing several torches. The glow on the horizon intensified. With a grim expression, Jon turned away from Yara and barked orders to his men. Positions. Ready the oil and fire. We hold them at the gates. She followed his gaze, seeing the unstoppable storm swirl closer, snow and ice swirling in white fury. The dead had arrived. Part of her wanted to warn Jon, to tell him he had no hope. Another part urged her to fight at his side, as once she might have done if fate had turned out differently. Her heart pounded. She had not counted on this. She had thought to come here, perhaps negotiate or deliver terms. But the dead's pace was unrelenting. They had arrived sooner than expected. She clenched her fists. This was no longer a simple raid. It was an onslaught. Jon's men scrambled along the battlements, lighting braziers of pitch. Flaming arrows streaked into the night. Yara could hear the shuffle and moan of wights beyond the walls. She glimpsed the silhouettes of the undead, a vast swarm, their eyes glinting like tiny azure beacons in the darkness. The gates began to buckle under a relentless pounding. The men on the ramparts cried out in terror, but they held their positions. Jon cast Yara a fierce look. If there's anything human left in you, help us. She ground her teeth, torn by the demand. Was there anything human left? She felt the icy bond that tied her to the Night King. She could sense his presence like a malignant star overshadowing her. A wave of wights pressed against the gate, and she knew from that bond that he was near, orchestrating the assault. She had a choice. Side with Jon Snow in a hopeless stand or fulfill her oath to the Great Other. If she chose the first, the Night King would surely cast her aside, freeze her blood in her veins. If she chose the second, she would watch men she had once respected torn apart. The Ironborn inside her roared for her to stand with the strong, to ensure her survival at any cost. But something else, that faint flicker of conscience, spoke louder in that moment. She yanked free her sword, stepping beside Jon. "Your men wouldn't stand a chance even if I decided otherwise," she said grimly. "But maybe I can buy you a little time. Don't expect any miracles." Jon gave her a tight nod, too pressed for time to argue. They rushed to the walls. Beyond them, whites assaulted with superhuman relentlessness, clawing and hammering. Archers fired flaming arrows down into the mass, but the undead came on regardless. A few caught fire and still advanced like torches moving in the gloom. The sound of their inhuman groans filled the night air. Yara's mind raced. She could feel the Night King's presence, a pressure telling her to open the gates, to sabotage the living. Her body trembled with the strain of resisting, uncertain if she even had the power to do so. She raised her sword to her men, who had gathered behind her in the courtyard. "Stand with me," she cried. "We hold or we die." Some of them hesitated. She could see the conflict in their eyes. They too felt that supernatural tug, the bond that came from serving the great other. But loyalty to Yara, forged in years of salt and iron, held stronger. They took up positions along the walls, fending off any white that managed to climb a gap. The gate shuddered. Jon shouted for oil to be poured. A half-dozen men struggled with a cauldron, tipping it over. Scalding oil splashed down onto the undead, who hissed and twitched but still hammered at the gate. Flaming arrows followed, igniting the oil in a burst of furious light. The smell of burning flesh was nauseating, but it forced the undead back momentarily. For a heartbeat, it seemed they might hold. But then the temperature dropped precipitously, and a blinding gust of snowy wind slammed into the walls, knocking men off their feet. Yara staggered, nearly slipping on the icy rampart. She glimpsed a tall figure in the swirling storm beyond the gate, mounted on a skeletal horse with glowing blue eyes. The Night King. With a single gesture, he doused the flames below, snuffing them as if they had never existed. The gate, weakened by the assault, broke with a resounding crash. Whites flooded into the courtyard, screeching like damned souls. Chaos erupted. Jon's men charged, swords and spears meeting the undead horde. The smaller fighting force was instantly overwhelmed, forced to give ground. Yara leapt into the fray, her sword hacking at half-rotted limbs that reached for her. She had fought men all her life, but these were not men. They felt no pain, feared no death. Her strokes had to be precise, decapitating or severing limbs. Otherwise, the whites kept coming. She saw a swirl of black hair as Jon Snow engaged a pack of them, his blade flashing. The courtyard filled with screams and the clash of steel. The few torches still lit cast flickering shadows that made the scene all the more nightmarish. Everywhere she turned, Yara faced that primal terror. These were her new allies, yet now they came to kill her because she had chosen, for this fleeting moment, to stand with the living. She felt the icy bond in her chest constrict, punishing her betrayal. Her breaths became labored. Frost began to spread along her sword hilt, biting into her palms. She gritted her teeth, forcing her limbs to move. "I won't die here," she growled. Jon's voice rang out, rallying the defenders. They managed to form a tight circle back to back as the horde pressed in. Men were dragged down, screaming by unholy strength. Yara fought with ferocious skill, cutting through rotted torsos, smashing skulls with the pommel of her sword, ignoring the biting cold that spread each time she struck. Blood, both living and blackened undead fluid, splattered the snowy ground. The final few archers loosed arrows in desperation, but the horde seemed endless. Suddenly, a swirl of movement parted the ranks of whites. The Night King himself entered the courtyard. He dismounted with a glacial elegance, stepping over corpses as if they were trivial obstacles. His icy gaze swept across the defenders, lingering on Jon and Yara. Jon brandished his sword, Valyrian steel glimmering with faint moonlight. The tension in the air was suffocating. Yara knew she was only alive this long because of the Night King's will. If he so chose, he could freeze her heart in an instant. She could feel that power thrumming in her veins. A final wave of despair washed over her. How could she have been so blind? She had not simply allied with a greater force. She had surrendered her will. Now that she defied him, she was cut off, a puppet with strings tangled. She felt the cold creeping through her limbs, threatening to petrify her where she stood. Jon attacked with a fierce cry, swinging his Valyrian steel blade at the Night King. The ancient being parried with inhuman speed, brandishing a wickedly curved ice spear. Sparks flew as steel met ice that did not shatter. They clashed again, Jon pressing forward in a desperate attempt to end this threat. For a moment, it seemed Jon might gain the upper hand, as his blade hissed through the air. But the Night King moved impossibly fast, deflecting each blow. Finally, with a shift of his wrist, he knocked Jon back, sending him skidding across the snow. Yara rushed forward, screaming, swinging her blade at the Night King's exposed flank. He turned, ice spear sweeping out, cracking her sword near the hilt. The force slammed her to the ground. The iron tang of blood filled her mouth. She rolled onto her side, struggling to stand. All around them, the whites had overwhelmed the defenders, driving them to the far corners of the courtyard. Some were pinned under the undead, still fighting with desperate last gasps. Jon staggered upright, his face streaked with blood, a wild determination still blazing in his eyes. The Night King lifted a hand, intent on finishing him. Yara, ignoring the pain in her ribs, hurled herself at the undead king's arm. She latched on, forcing it away from Jon. But the instant she touched him, she felt agony course through her body, as if her very blood froze mid-flow. The bond was punishing her betrayal. She managed a strangled cry, "Run, Jon!" But Jon did not run. With a last surge, he swung his Valyrian blade up, aiming for the Night King's chest. The ancient foe twisted aside, letting the blow glance off his frozen armor. Another swirl of movement, and he flung Yara aside like a rag doll. She crashed into the remains of a wagon, splintering wood. Through the haze of pain, she saw the Night King close in on Jon. For an instant, everything slowed. Jon tried one last thrust, but the Night King shattered his sword with the ice spear. Shards of Valyrian steel rained down, glinting in the dim torchlight. Jon fell backward, unarmed, as the Night King loomed overhead, raising the spear to deliver the killing blow. But at that moment, a roar echoed from above, and fire lit the sky. A dragon's roar. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape descended, flames spewing from its maw. The courtyard exploded into chaos as dragonfire engulfed the whites. The Night King snarled, stumbling backward. Another figure dropped down amid the confusion. Daenerys Targaryen, hair whipped by the wind, face set in determination. She shouted a command, and her dragon unleashed another torrent of flame that blasted the courtyard, incinerating dozens of whites. They screeched in agony, collapsing into ash and charred bone. Jon scrambled clear, seizing a stray sword from the ground. The Night King, forced to retreat from the dragon's fury, faded back into the swirling ranks of his undead horde. For one brief, blazing moment, hope flared among the living as Daenerys' forces, small though they were, charged into the courtyard, cutting down whites. The fire and steel combination gave them a fighting chance. Yara pulled herself from the wreckage, blinking to clear her vision. She could barely stand. Her entire body felt encased in ice. The bond hammered at her consciousness, punishing her. She knew she had made an irreparable choice. She stumbled forward, trying to reach Jon, who was busy rallying the defenders with Daenerys' unexpected help. The courtyard was an inferno now. Flames licked at the walls, turning snow to steam, corpses to embers. She glimpsed the Night King in the distance, standing among his legion as the dragon circled overhead. His expression was unreadable, yet she felt the weight of his wrath. She had betrayed him. She was cast out. As the living defenders consolidated around Daenerys' dragon, the Night King raised his arms, resurrecting fresh whites from the newly dead strewn across the courtyard. Bodies twitched and rose. The defenders gasped, forced to face their own fallen comrades. "Fall back!" someone shouted. "Fall back to the keep!" Men scrambled, but the reanimated corpses pressed in, clawing and snarling. Fire roared as the dragon unleashed another torrent, momentarily stalling the tide. Jon, Daenerys, and a cluster of survivors managed to retreat toward the gatehouse, half-collapsed though it was. Yara realized she was caught behind enemy lines. Whites prowled all around, yet none attacked her. They seemed uncertain whether to tear her apart or obey the connection that still lingered. Summoning the last of her strength, she forced her numb legs to move, weaving through the chaos. The Night King advanced. For an instant, she stood face to face with him amid the flames. His blue eyes bored into her, an accusation of silent betrayal. "I will not kneel," she said, spitting blood. Then she lifted her broken sword in a defiant salute. The courtyard vanished in a swirl of icy darkness. The next thing she knew, she was on the ground, body racked with shivers. When she looked up, the Night King was gone, leading his legion deeper into the city. The dragon's roar and the clash of steel echoed from the inner walls. Yara coughed, struggling to breathe, each inhalation slicing her lungs. She tasted blood and realized she might be dying. She thought of Theon, of the sea, of the vow she had made to protect her people, and the terrible choice that had led her to this moment. Her vision dimmed, her limbs twitched. The bond's chill consumed her from the inside. At the edge of her awareness, she sensed shapes moving toward her. She braced for whites, but instead saw a pair of Jon's men, eyes wide with fear and caution. One of them hefted her up, half dragging her away from the inferno. She lacked the strength to resist. She realized they were taking her to Jon. Her last conscious thought was the faint whisper of the ocean's roar in her mind, that memory of waves crashing on the Iron Island's shores. Then everything went black. She dreamt of swirling ice and heartbreak, of reeving ships that sailed a frozen sea. She saw the unstoppable might of the Night King, and she saw the tattered remnants of humanity burning in the last pockets of resistance. She did not know what fate awaited her in the realm of the living, whether she would be condemned for treachery or forgiven in the name of necessity. But in her darkest dreams, she could not escape the knowledge that she had helped unleash winter upon the world, that she had shattered the seas she once loved. If she survived the night, her story was far from over. The sun had not risen, and the dead marched on. And so began the age of icebound tides and uncertain alliances, a time when Yara Greyjoy stood with one foot in each world, bound by a frozen oath to the Night King, yet swayed by the faint flicker of humanity that remained in her heart. In the distance, the sea lay encased in glimmering frost, its waves stilled, its spirit shackled by winter's hand, a fitting monument to the choices that had brought them all to this point. A hush deeper than death, ruling over land and sea alike. Yara Greyjoy drifted on the edge of oblivion, drawn between the living and the dead, between the warmth of mortal blood and the chill that seeped from the mark the Night King had pressed upon her soul. She had no sense of how long she lay unconscious in that ruined courtyard of Maidenpool, the screams of the dying still echoing somewhere in the recesses of her mind. The last thing she remembered was the Night King's inhuman gaze locking on her, his hatred and betrayal manifesting as a freezing torment in her veins. Then Daenerys's dragonfire turned the world into an inferno of light and roaring flame, and darkness claimed her. When she woke, it was to pain, a deep, biting pain, as though her bones had cracked and refrozen a dozen times. Her eyelids felt heavy, reluctant to open, but gradually, she forced them apart. Flickers of orange light danced across a damp stone ceiling. A brazier burned nearby, exuding little comfort in the frigid night air. She lay on a cot, a crude pillow beneath her head, a scratchy blanket tossed over her legs. The coat and leathers she had worn into the battle were gone. A rough linen shirt replaced them, stiff with frost around the edges. Her entire body trembled. Every muscle ached, and her head pounded as though filled with shards of ice. She tried to shift upright, but her left side stabbed her with such intensity that she nearly cried out. Gritting her teeth, she managed a half-reclined position. Only then did she notice a shape stirring by the brazier. A man, broad-shouldered, cloaked in a heavy fur. At first, she expected one of her Ironborn, but as he turned, she recognized the shadowy face, the dark hair, the watchful eyes. Jon Snow. He stepped closer, the firelight revealing weariness etched into every line of his face. She saw bandages across one of his forearms, and the cloak he wore was scorched at the hem, an echo of that chaotic night. Gently, he placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her to remain still. "You're alive," he said quietly, voice husky from exhaustion. "The maester told me you were half frozen, half burned. We weren't sure if you'd wake." Yara swallowed. Her throat felt raw, as if she'd swallowed shards of glass. "Where?" She couldn't manage more than that single word. "Maidenpool's citadel," Jon replied, his gaze flicking around the cramped chamber. "What's left of it? We've reclaimed a corner of the town, for now." He paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. Daenerys's arrival caught the Night King by surprise. He withdrew part of his army to regroup. "We lost most of Maidenpool regardless. The dead still prowl in the streets." Yara's heart sank. She remembered the unstoppable wave of whites, their eyes glowing with hatred. It had been more an onslaught than a battle, like the tide of a bitter winter sea rising inexorably over everything in its path. "He'll come back," she said hoarsely. "He never truly retreats." Jon nodded grimly. "We know." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the swirl of memories wash over her. She saw the fortress of black ice, the labyrinthine corridors where she'd knelt before an inhuman power. She saw the silence locked in a sea of frost, her men torn between their loyalty to her and their subjugation by winter's iron will. Then the culminating betrayal, her choice to help Jon Snow and Daenerys hold the gate, if only for those few desperate minutes. "Why am I still alive?" she asked, forcing her voice to steady. "He should have killed me the moment I turned on him." Jon exhaled, folding his arms. "Maybe he meant to, but Daenerys and the Dragonfire intervened. By the time the flames died, you were cast aside. You looked half dead." He offered no judgment in his words, but she heard the heavy question unspoken. "You helped him freeze the seas. You turned your Ironborn into thralls of the dead. Why show mercy now? Or perhaps, why betray him at the last?" She had no easy answers. The swirling guilt and anger threatened to overwhelm her. She shifted her gaze to the side. Her left arm and shoulder were wrapped in thick bandages where the spear blow or flying debris had caught her. "My men?" she asked. "The Ironborn who followed me here?" Jon's expression tightened. "Some escaped the courtyard with you. A handful were wounded. Others got separated in the chaos and retreated to the silence or deeper into the city. We've taken in those we could. They're under guard for now." Guard, of course. She had helped lead an undead invasion. He'd be a fool to trust her or her people. Still, hearing that at least a few survived eased an ache in her chest. The Ironborn under her command were not necessarily at fault for the path she had chosen. Yet the memory of them, standing side by side with whites on the deck of the Silence, churned her stomach. "And the Silence?" she forced herself to ask. "She's anchored down the coast a ways," Jon said, "surrounded by ice floes and whites. Your Ironborn there refused to let anyone else board. At least that's what my scouts say. They seem uncertain, as though they're waiting for orders from you. But the dead in the area have no leader at present. The main host is still with the Night King." A surge of guilt clawed at her. She imagined her men on the Silence, not knowing whether to obey the Night King's freezing will or remain loyal to the Greyjoy name. She had always prided herself on commanding fear and respect in equal measure, but this new reality rendered the old rules meaningless. "They're half-bound," she murmured, recalling that moment of contact in the fortress depths when she had felt cold seep into her blood. Not fully whites, not free men. Something in between. Jon's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, battling a wave of shame. "When I made my pact with him, my offer to freeze the seas so the Ironborn could strike anywhere, it wasn't just words. I let him mark me, bind me, and through me he touched my men. They've tasted his power, enough that they can't easily break free." Jon looked both horrified and sorrowful at once. "That's why you survived," he said, voice hushed. "He changed you. You're not entirely mortal anymore. The cold in you, I've never seen anything like it." She flexed her fingers, noticing for the first time that the tips of her nails were tinged blue. A swirl of panic rose. She felt that chill coiled inside her chest, suppressed now, but ever present. "I turned on him in Maiden Pool," she said, voice trembling. "And I felt this agony ever since, as if I'm a traitor to his magic, and it punishes me. If he focuses on me, I don't know if I can fight it." Jon placed a cautious hand on her uninjured shoulder. "Maybe there's a way to sever that bond," he said. "Dragonfire, dragonglass, something. We'll find it." She let out a bitter laugh. "And if there isn't?" He didn't answer. They both knew time was short. The armies of the dead would not pause while they solved Yara's curse. Already, the living were pressed on all sides. Euron Greyjoy's whereabouts were unknown. The Lannisters were rumored to have fallen back to King's Landing, or perhaps Cersei was dead and the city in chaos. Daenerys Targaryen had presumably come north with at least one dragon, Drogon, or perhaps Rhaegal, yet her forces were likely scattered, battered from earlier battles. After a moment of brooding silence, Jon raked a hand through his hair. "Daenerys wants to speak with you when you can stand. She doesn't trust you. How could she? But she saw you protect me in that courtyard. She's willing to hear what you have to say." Yara swallowed, trying to steel herself. "What can I say?" she muttered. "I damned my people, froze the seas for him. Now the entire coast is vulnerable." "Tell her everything," Jon urged, softly but firmly. "We have to figure out how the Night King is freezing the sea so quickly. If there's a weak point, if there's a way to break the ice or keep it from spreading further, we need that knowledge. Otherwise, we'll all be overrun." She turned her head away, eyes sliding over the shadows that flickered on the stone walls. She wanted to hurl curses, to rage at the unfairness that had driven her to this end. But deep inside, she knew she had chosen this path. She had made the desperate gamble to win the Iron Islands a seat of power in a new, frozen world. Now she had to reckon with the consequences. Jon took a step back, giving her space. "Rest if you can," he said. "The Maester will come with medicine soon. We've secured a small portion of the citadel, enough to tend the wounded. Daenerys and I are trying to rally survivors. Maidenpool's gates are shattered, but the keep might hold until we can withdraw or mount a defense. The Night King hasn't fully committed again. Not yet. Perhaps he's waiting for something." Yara's throat tightened. "Waiting for me?" she rasped. "To bow again or be destroyed?" Jon's face hardened. "Then he waits in vain." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving her to the flickering light of the brazier. She drifted in and out of fitful sleep for the next few hours, haunted by nightmares. She saw the silence locked in ice, the whites hunched on deck, her men's eyes glowing with that eerie blue, flesh stiff with frost. In her dreams, she heard Theon calling to her from the ship's hold, his voice cracking with fear, but she could not reach him. Then the dream would shift, and she stood in the throne room of Pike's great keep, water dripping from the walls. The Night King sat upon the seastone chair, the black rock carved in the shape of a kraken. He beckoned her closer, wordless, unstoppable, and she knelt despite every instinct screaming not to. When she looked down, her hands were rotting, her skin split by blue-white veins of ice. She jerked awake every time, drenched in a cold sweat that froze on her brow. Morning brought only half light, a pale, watery sun barely visible behind iron-gray clouds. The Maester, an older man with shaky hands, checked her bandages, applied a pungent poultice to her wounds, and made her drink a bitter tonic. She demanded to walk, to see her men, to speak with Daenerys, but the Maester shook his head with paternal sternness. "You'll tear your stitches. The cold in your blood is no small ailment. You need time." Yara almost laughed. Time was exactly what they did not have, but the pounding in her skull forced her to relent. She slumped back against the cot, cursing under her breath. Even the slightest movement stabbed her ribs. Closing her eyes, she tried to wrestle her thoughts into coherence. She could still feel that faint pull, like a monstrous undertow, the hush of ice that threatened to drown her will. If the Night King wished it, he could reach into her heart and shatter it. She only hoped the dragonfire had weakened his hold, enough, at least, to give her a chance to break free entirely. At midday, the sound of commotion in the halls roused her from a shallow doze. Armored footfalls, urgent voices. She heard the heavy scrape of the door's bar, and the door banged open. Men in dented plate, Targaryen soldiers, if the small dragons on their armor were any sign, marched in, flanking Daenerys Targaryen herself. She looked like a figure carved from ivory and steel, her silver-white hair braided back from her face. A thick fur cloak draped over her shoulders to ward off the northern chill. Beneath her cloak, she wore leather armor dyed pale gray, as if in mourning. Her features were taut with anger and concern, her violet eyes fixed on Yara with laser intensity. "Leave us," Daenerys told the guards. They hesitated. "Now," she repeated, and they bowed before stepping out, though they remained outside the door, ready to storm in if needed. Yara's heart beat faster. She tried to sit up straighter, ignoring the agony in her side. Daenerys wasted no time. "Jon tells me you have vital knowledge of how he's freezing the coasts," she said, skipping any greeting. "If that knowledge is real, it might save lives. Or perhaps you've come to sow discord. Speak plainly." Yara swallowed hard. The presence of the Dragon Queen was a tangible force. She could still see flecks of soot in Daenerys's braids, likely from the battle, and the faint odor of dragon smoke clung to her cloak. "I owe you no apologies," Yara managed, "but I will tell you what I know." Daenerys's jaw flexed. "Very well. Talk." Yara gathered her thoughts. She described her journey north, how she sought the Night King to leverage the cold for the Ironborn's gain. She explained the fortress of black ice, the unnatural hush, the labyrinth inside which she had bargained away her future. She recounted how the Night King had marked her and through her, touched her men. "He's freezing the sea by funneling his power through those marked," she said. White walkers, yes, they spread cold, but this is something deeper. It's linked to that fortress he created or found on the northern sea. It's a nexus, a place where winter's magic is strongest. From there, he channels it across the water. Daenerys listened in silence, eyes narrowing as she tried to piece the puzzle together. "You're saying it isn't just that he has the power to freeze anything he touches," she ventured. "He's extended that power by forging bonds with living allies, like you." Yara nodded. "He uses the living as conduits because we can sail and move in ways the dead can't. That's how my men ended up caught between. The more hearts he marks, the faster his winter spreads across the coasts. I suspect he wants to do the same in major strongholds, to ensure the freeze creeps inland." Daenerys's lips pressed into a thin line. "And your Ironborn were the first of many, if he had his way." "Likely," Yara admitted, a wave of shame washing over her. "I thought I could gain autonomy for the Iron Islands, that he'd let us survive as we'd always done, taking what we wanted, thriving on the seas. I was wrong. He doesn't share power. He only grants illusions of it." Daenerys stepped closer, peering into Yara's face as if searching for deception. "Jon said you saved his life," she said, her tone softer. "At the gate." Yara shrugged, which made her wince. "I saw the alternative too clearly. I couldn't let him die like that, not when I had a chance to do something. But," she inhaled a shaky breath, "if you're wondering whether you can trust me, I can't even trust myself. The Night King's hold on me isn't broken." Daenerys studied her, calculating. "Could you get close to him again under a ruse and strike? End him from within?" Her voice carried a fierce hope, tempered by the awareness that this might be a foolish gamble. Yara shook her head quickly. "You don't understand. If I approach him under false pretenses, he'll sense it. When I turned on him, I felt something rip inside me. He knows. If I tried it again, he would kill me in a breath." She bit her lip, feeling a tremor in her hand. "I'm not offering an infiltration. All I can give is knowledge, how this ice magic binds the seas, how it might be undone. Daenerys leaned forward. Then how do we undo it? Yara closed her eyes, thinking back to the Black Fortress, the memory of the twisting corridors and the central cavern. He draws from some source beneath that fortress, some ancient wellspring of magical water that he ices and unices at will. I saw him demonstrate it. If you could destroy or disrupt that place, maybe the entire chain of frozen seas would fracture. But how can you get there? She let out a hollow laugh. It's in the far north, locked in an endless glacier, and the fortress is guarded by White Walkers and Whites in the thousands. Worse, it's nearly unreachable by ship. The silence only made it because we were guided. Daenerys's expression darkened. A fortress of ice in the far north, behind armies of the dead. Even if we reached it, we'd have to face him and his generals on ground they control absolutely. She let that sink in, silent for a moment. We might have one advantage. I still have my dragons. There was an edge of pride and pain in her voice. Viserion had been lost to the Night King, but Drogon and Rhaegal remained. Dragonfire could melt that ice. But reaching the fortress, you'd have to fight through storms conjured by the Night King, Yara said. You saw what happened to Viserion above the wall, didn't you? He was shot down by that ice spear. The Night King is lethal against dragons in open air. Daenerys's face clouded with grief, but she nodded. He is, she said thickly. We'd need a plan. Perhaps if we brought enough ground support. Wildlings, Northmen, unsullied Dothraki. She frowned. But we're scattered, half our forces lost in earlier battles. And the dead push south every day. Yara said nothing. They both knew time was short. The free peoples of Westeros were fracturing under the weight of winter's onslaught. Even if the realm could rally, so many knights and lords still squabbled over the Iron Throne, or refused to believe the scale of the threat until it was on their doorstep. Meanwhile, the seas that could have ferried them to safety, or allowed Daenerys's fleet to maneuver, were turning to ice and handing the Night King easy passage. Daenerys's eyes flicked to the bandages on Yara's shoulder. Rest, she said at last, an undercurrent of tension in her voice. When you're stronger, we'll decide your fate. But if you're genuine in wanting to right this wrong. Her voice trailed off, and she lifted her chin, regal as ever. I'll speak with Jon. There might be a way to use your link to him. If nothing else, we'll need you if we want any chance of saving your Ironborn from that half-slavery. Yara nodded, too drained to muster more than a quiet, thank you. Daenerys stepped away, pausing at the door to glance back. For a moment, something like empathy flickered in her eyes. I know how desperation feels, she said softly. How it can lead us to strike bargains that seem necessary at the time. I don't excuse what you've done, but I understand. With that, she swept out of the chamber, the door closing behind her. Days blurred as Yara recuperated. The city around them teetered between life and death. Maidenpool's main gate remained a shattered ruin, and the undead lurked in the outskirts, launching small raids whenever night fell. Daenerys's dragons soared overhead to drive them back with flame, but each engagement chipped away at the defenders. By the third day, the hush of encroaching winter threatened to smother the entire region. The swirling snows thickened, and even midday resembled twilight under the heavy clouds. Each morning, Yara forced herself out of bed despite the maester's protests, determined to walk, to relearn her own strength. The frigid air in the corridors made her side throb with every step. A layer of ice coated windows and arrow slits, and in the darkest hallways, frost sparkled on the walls. The men huddled around braziers, stoking them with precious fuel. Some clutched totems of the Seven, or the old gods, or the Lord of Light, praying for deliverance. Soldiers eyed Yara suspiciously whenever she passed, many knowing who she was and what she had done. She kept her head high, meeting their gazes without flinching, but inside she felt the weight of guilt. On her second morning walking the halls, she found a group of Ironborn in a makeshift cell in the keep's lower levels. Bare stone walls, straw on the floor, a single barred door guarded by 2 Targaryen spearmen. 4 of her men were there, Harl, Dagon, and 2 others. They looked battered, pallid, as though the cold had sapped their vitality. The moment they saw her, they sprang to their feet and pressed against the bars, hands white-knuckled. "Captain," Harl rasped, voice raw. "You're alive." His eyes darted as if expecting whites to emerge from the shadows. "They said you were half dead, that maybe you were one of them." She swallowed. "I'm still me," she said quietly, stepping closer. She noticed how Dagon trembled with each breath. "What about you lot?" Harl grimaced. "We feel it," he whispered, looking at the swirling frost around the cell's edges. "The curse. Our blood's not our own anymore. Sometimes I hear voices." He shuddered. "In the night, I see the fortress." Dagon nodded, his face slick with perspiration despite the chill. "We're trying to resist, but it's so damn cold, and part of me wants to follow it, like it's calling." Yara's stomach turned. She reached through the bars, gripping Harl's arm. Even his skin felt colder than it should. "We're going to find a way out of this," she said, though she hardly believed it. "Just hold on." The guard glowered at her, shifting his spear. "You'll speak with them later," he barked, clearly uncomfortable. "They're not to be released without the Queen's express command." Yara tightened her jaw. "Understood." She turned back to her men, her voice dropping. "Stay strong. I'll come for you." She walked away, a storm of conflicting emotions roiling in her chest. What had she done to them? The men who had sailed under her banner had trusted her. Now they were trapped in limbo, neither wholly alive nor dead, yearning for a cold master. She wanted to scream, to lash out at something, but she had no target except the unstoppable tide of winter. By the 5th day of her convalescence, rumors spread that the Night King's main host was on the march again. Scouts reported sightings of whites crossing the frozen shallows near Cracklaw Point, heading south. The bulk of his legion had bypassed Maidenpool, at least temporarily, continuing toward Rosby and perhaps eventual King's Landing. Yet smaller pockets of undead still lingered in the city, enough to harass and kill any unguarded group. Daenerys, Jon, and what remained of their forces debated retreat. Maidenpool offered no strategic advantage if the main threat was moving south. They had too few men to hold it, and the supply stores were nearly depleted. Jon and Daenerys summoned Yara to a council in a half-ruined hall once belonging to House Mouton. The roof had collapsed in places, letting in swirling snow and bits of weak sunlight. Around a cracked wooden table stood some of the realm's surviving leaders. Ser Davos Seaworth, his face lined with worry. Grey Worm of the Unsullied, stoic despite the near-constant cold. A handful of northern bannermen wearing furs and scowls, and a few Riverlands knights wearing the sigils of houses that had mostly fallen to the dead. The group eyed Yara warily when she entered, but Daenerys gestured for her to stand near the table. Jon tapped a map with a gloved finger. "We have conflicting rumors about King's Landing. Some say Cersei's dead. Others claim she still rules. But the Lannister forces have largely scattered. If the Night King's main army marches on King's Landing, all those people will be trapped. We could attempt to intercept him or evacuate the city." He looked to Daenerys. "What do you think?" Daenerys's eyes flicked to Yara momentarily before returning to the map. "A direct confrontation outside King's Landing is risky. The city walls won't keep out the dead for long if the seas remain frozen. Yet can we afford to let them become whites?" She exhaled, her breath steaming. "We have one advantage, the dragons. But if we commit them, we risk losing them to that cursed spear. Once the Night King sees them, he'll aim to replicate what he did to Viserion." Davos cleared his throat. "Pardon, Your Grace, but we're short on good choices. If King's Landing falls, that's 1,000,000 souls turned into an army of whites. Unstoppable. Perhaps it's better to strike first, or at least try to evacuate the people to safer ground." A Riverlands knight snorted. "What safe ground? Everywhere is turning to ice." Daenerys pressed a hand to her temple. "I know, but if we do nothing, the realm is doomed." Jon's gaze slid to Yara. "Could the Ironborn help? Those who aren't enthralled might still control ships that can cross open water, if there is any open water left. Could we ferry refugees away?" Break the ice in some manner? Yara grimaced. Some lesser islands and coasts might remain ice-free for the moment, but the freeze spreads daily, and my Uncle Euron's fleet is unaccounted for. If he still roams the seas, he's no ally of ours. He'd turn on you in a heartbeat to seize his own advantage. And the rest of the Iron Fleet, my father's old ships, were scattered or destroyed. We don't have enough vessels to evacuate a fraction of King's Landing's population. A troubled silence fell. Grey Worm spoke next, his voice calm and measured. What about this fortress in the far north? The place from which he draws power to freeze the seas. If we destroy it, we weaken him, yes. Yara inclined her head. I believe so, but I have no proof. It's a risk. The journey alone could kill half your army if we tried to march overland. The storm's up there, and from the sea, it's nearly impossible to approach if you're not guided by his power. That's how I did it. I was led by whites. So we can't get there from here, Ser Davos said flatly. Daenerys tapped her knuckles on the table. Perhaps not in force, but what if we tried a smaller strike team? Jon and I, a handful of the best fighters, and the dragons. We slip past the main army, fly north. If we can endure the storms, maybe we can land near the fortress, melt the ice, do something to disrupt that wellspring of magic. Jon's expression was grim. It's a desperation move. Davos's eyes widened. You'd be flying right into the Night King's domain. One well-placed spear, and all is lost. Better to try that than watch the entire realm freeze, Daenerys countered. If we succeed, the seas might thaw or at least lose enough ice that the living can fight back. I can't guarantee it'll stop his whole invasion, but it might stem the tide. The question is how to keep the Night King from simply intercepting us, and how to find the fortress if it's hidden in storms. All eyes turned to Yara. She felt her stomach twist. You want me to guide you, she said quietly. Daenerys lifted her chin. No one else alive has been there. You have a connection to him. Maybe you can sense it, track it. If you come with us, you could show us the route and help us avoid the worst of his illusions. Perhaps your bond can shield our presence until we're close enough to strike. Yara gritted her teeth. Part of her wanted to refuse. She had barely survived that place once, and if the Night King caught her returning, his vengeance would be swift. But the alternative was to watch the continent drown in frost, or to see her men further enslaved by an unstoppable fiend. She let out a shuddering breath. All right, she said at last. I'll guide you, but you must understand, I can't guarantee we won't all die halfway there. And if he senses me, we know, Jon said gently, but we have no other plan. They hammered out the details for hours. The small strike team would consist of Daenerys, Jon, a handful of elite fighters. Grey Worm insisted on coming, Ser Jorah Mormont if he could be found in time, perhaps a few others. They would travel light, riding the dragons, carrying dragonglass weapons and wildfire if any could be spared. The rest of the living army would march south to attempt an evacuation or a last stand near King's Landing. With any luck, the Night King would focus on the capital's fall, not suspecting a daring infiltration behind his lines. As dawn broke the next morning, they prepared to depart. The bitter wind howled through Maidenpool, carrying flecks of snow that stung the skin. Yara stood in the courtyard, wincing as she pulled on a heavier cloak and gingerly adjusted the bandage beneath her leathers. Her wounds were still fresh, but if she waited any longer, the cold creeping through her blood might claim her anyway. Better to act now, while a spark of defiance remained. Grey Worm approached, eyes as impassive as ever. We leave soon. Can you ride? I'll manage, Yara said, though the thought of riding a dragon made her heart hammer. She was iron-born. She knew ships, sails, the salt wind. Dragons were a southern power, a legacy of old Valyria. Yet if sailing was impossible in the far north, riding the beasts might be the only way. They walked together to the partially collapsed gate, where Daenerys waited near the hulking shape of Drogon, who crouched with wings furled. Rhaegal circled overhead, scanning for threats. The sight of two living dragons in a realm half consumed by ice was both heartening and terrifying. Daenerys was already mounted on Drogon's neck, clad in fur and leather, her posture regal. Jon stood at the dragon's shoulder, a heavy cloak swirling around his legs. He turned as Yara and Grey Worm arrived. "Just the four of us?" Yara asked, scanning for any sign of Ser Davos or others. Jon gave a curt nod. "Davos is heading south with the remaining forces to help with evacuation. Others will meet us if they can catch up." He looked around the courtyard at the ragged defenders. "We can't wait. Reports say the Night King is near Rosby, maybe farther by now. We must strike as soon as possible." Grey Worm stepped forward, determined. "I will fly with you, your grace," he said to Daenerys. He carried a short spear of steel and dragonglass. A sword hung at his belt. "The Unsullied will not falter." Daenerys inclined her head, then turned her gaze to Yara. "Climb on behind Jon," she instructed. "Regal is large enough for 2 riders now. You can guide us." Yara's palms sweated despite the chill. She had fought her entire life to avoid kneeling or letting fear control her. Now she was about to mount a dragon, trusting it not to fling her to her death, and trusting the Targaryen queen to keep her from succumbing to the Night King's call. She stepped to Regal's side, where a makeshift saddle had been secured. Regal huffed, his eyes flicking over her. She hesitated, then placed a careful hand on his scaled flank. The dragon radiated heat, an odd sensation against the raw cold in her own skin. Jon offered a hand to help her up, but she scowled, ignoring the stab of pain in her ribs. She hoisted herself into the saddle behind him, lips pressed tightly. He glanced back as she settled, and for a moment their eyes met, his carried tension and a flicker of empathy. "Hold on," he muttered. "Regal can be unpredictable. Lean with him when he banks. Try not to fall off." She snorted. "I've ridden out storms at sea. How hard can it be?" But her bravado crumbled the moment Regal launched skyward. The ground fell away in a dizzying rush. Her stomach lurched as she clutched at the back of the saddle, struggling to keep her seat. The dragon's wings flapped powerfully, sending a rush of wind that scattered snow across the courtyard below. Yara's heart pounded like a drum. This was nothing like a ship. The shift of air, the plunging ascents and descents. Each was more terrifying than any tempest she had weathered on the Iron Islands. A moment later, Drogon rose alongside them, Daenerys at the helm with Grey Worm clinging behind. The 2 dragons soared into a sky heavy with slate-gray clouds. Yara risked a glance down. Maidenpool shrank to a cluster of walls and roofs, ringed by the swirling gloom of ice-slick farmland. Then Regal banked westward, following Drogon. Jon pressed his heels gently against the dragon's flanks, guiding him in formation. The cold wind whipped Yara's face, stinging her eyes. Snow stung her cheeks, and her side throbbed with every gust. Higher and higher they climbed, leaving behind the broken city and the faint forms of men. The land rolled away beneath them, dotted with forests turned white by snow. Rivers glistened with ice. It was a haunted panorama, once lush farmland now strangled by winter. Yara swallowed hard. She could almost sense the Night King's presence somewhere, a subtle vibration in her bones. They flew for hours. The sun never truly broke through the clouds, leaving the world in perpetual half-light. Daenerys guided them north and slightly east, aiming for a route that would bypass the largest pockets of undead, though it was impossible to know exactly where they lurked. Now and again, the dragons glided low over deserted villages. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, mostly near well-defended keeps. The roads lay empty, blanketed in snow. At one point, they sat down in a small valley to rest the dragons and eat a meager lunch, hardtack and dried meat. Grey Worm remained silent, scanning the horizon with a soldier's vigilance. Jon crouched by a half-frozen stream, letting Regal drink. Daenerys dismounted and paced, occasionally resting a hand on Drogon's flank as if seeking reassurance. The dragons seemed uneasy, snapping at the cold wind. Yara felt it too, the sense of a looming shadow that stretched across the land. She tried not to think about how close the Night King might be. "We'll reach the coast by nightfall if we keep pace," Jon said, looking at Daenerys and Yara. After that, you're our guide, Yara. How do we find this fortress? She wished she had a simple answer. I remember heading due north from Hardhome's latitude, but out to sea, or what used to be sea. Now it might be more land than water. Once we see ice floes the size of small islands, we're close. The storms will be fierce. Daenerys nodded. We'll rely on your sense, your bond, to lead us. Let's waste no time. They flew on. As dusk approached, the clouds thickened, and the wind grew icy. The dragons roared in protest, fighting gusts that buffeted them. Yara's teeth clacked together from the cold despite the heat radiating from Regal's body. If not for that warmth, she might have frozen solid hours ago. The land below thinned into rocky coasts battered by surf. Yara recognized the area near Eastwatch's ruins, though they were too far inland to see the broken wall from here. Eventually, darkness settled, forcing them to land. No sense flying blind into a magical storm. They found a sheltered cove where the water hadn't fully frozen yet, hidden by rocky cliffs. As the dragons curled up, Jon and Daenerys scouted for driftwood, though precious little was dry enough for a fire. They managed a weak blaze that cast flickering shadows on the cliff face. Grey Worm stood watch near the open beach, spear in hand, while the rest huddled around the fire. Yara stared into the flames, the ache in her ribs steadily worsening. Each breath was an effort. She let her eyes close, the warmth lulling her. Then, unbidden, she felt the hush of the Night King slip into her consciousness, an echo of the dream. She jerked upright with a gasp, startling Jon. Her vision swam, and the brand on her chest seemed to pulse with cold. "What is it?" Jon asked, alarmed. She pressed a hand to her sternum. "He's near," she breathed. "Not physically, but he senses my presence. I think he knows we're coming." Daenerys exchanged a glance with Jon. "We press on at first light," she decided. "If he suspects we're near, we can't give him time to tighten his defenses, or to trap us in a storm." Yara only nodded, swallowing her fear. If the Night King truly was aware, then every mile they flew north might be walking into a snare. But they had to continue, there was no turning back. She pulled her cloak tighter, glancing at the dragons. Even with their might, they were 4 mortals against an ancient being who commanded an endless legion. The odds felt laughable. That night, sleep came in fitful snatches. Yara dreamt of Pike's towers battered by a white tempest. The sea below was frozen, monstrous waves locked in place like sculpted glass. Euron Greyjoy's laughter echoed across the ice. Then the fortress of black ice loomed, swallowing all. She woke shivering, tears freezing on her cheeks. They began again before dawn, launching into a steel-gray sky. Snow pelted them almost horizontally, lashing their faces. Visibility dropped to a few hundred yards at best. Yara squinted past Jon's shoulder, straining to see. She felt that tug in her heart, guiding them northward. Daenerys and Drogon stayed close, the 2 dragons exchanging shrill cries whenever one drifted too far in the swirling white. Hours passed, lost in a howling gale. The coastline vanished beneath an expanse of ice floes colliding and grinding in the surf. Sometimes Yara spotted open leads of water between them, but they were narrow and swiftly closing. Beneath the half-light, the ice reflected an eerie bluish glow, reminiscent of White Walker eyes. It made her skin crawl. They pressed on, the temperature plunging. Even the dragons seemed to struggle, buffeted by unnatural winds. At one point, Regal let out a furious roar and began descending. Jon fought to keep him steady. They landed on a massive ice sheet that rose and fell with the sluggish tide. Yara slipped off the saddle, stumbling in waist-deep snow. Her breath caught in her throat. The cold stabbed her like knives. She turned to see Daenerys and Grey Worm land nearby on Drogon. The Queen's face was drawn with tension, lips almost blue. "We can't keep flying blind," Daenerys shouted over the wind. "Yara, do you feel anything? Are we close?" Yara shuddered, wiping snow from her lashes. She tried to concentrate on that bond in her chest, but all she felt was pain. "I'm not sure," she managed, her teeth chattering. The storms are stronger here. He's using them to hide. Grey Worm scanned the horizon, spear in hand, though there was nothing to see but roiling clouds of snow. We should try to move on foot? Jon looked grim. In this cold, with the dragons exhausted, we could freeze in minutes. But Yara had the sense that if they remained, they'd be sitting targets. The wind howled, carrying strange echoes. She turned a slow circle on the ice, searching for any sign of that black fortress. A swirl of memory returned to her, the shape of jagged spires, the massive gate. As if in answer, a flicker of black appeared in the distance, half seen through sheets of blowing snow. She blinked. Maybe it was only a shadow. Then lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the horizon briefly, and she saw it. A dark spike in the swirling white. Impossible to gauge distance, but it had the same unnatural silhouette burned into her nightmares. "There!" she cried, pointing. "I see it, or part of it." Jon and Daenerys followed her gaze. "We mount up again," Daenerys declared. "We'll fly as close as we can, then land out of sight and proceed on foot if needed." Yara swallowed. She couldn't shake the dread curling in her gut. But this was what they'd come for. She hauled herself back onto Rhaegal behind Jon. The dragon needed no urging. Perhaps he too sensed that malevolent presence. He shot upward with a powerful heave, and Drogon followed, Grey Worm clinging on. The wind hammered them from all sides, nearly tearing Yara's hood away. She hunkered down, burying her face in Jon's cloak to shield it from the needles of sleet. Minute by minute, the black silhouette grew. It was less a fortress than a nightmare congealed out of ice and shadows. Its walls loomed, ridged with twisted spires, as if sculpted by centuries of unnatural winds. Lightning flickered again, revealing a front gate carved into the glacial wall, large enough for a giant to pass. Her stomach lurched in recognition. This was the place where she had bargained with death. A savage wind buffeted Rhaegal, forcing him into a sideways descent. Jon cursed, struggling for control. Yara glimpsed something else. Tall figures striding across the ice below, their skin pallid and their armor gleaming with frost. White walkers, perhaps a dozen of them, arrayed in a line near the fortress entrance. They carried long spears or swords of ice, scanning the sky as though waiting. One of them raised an arm. Could it be the Night King himself? She couldn't tell from this altitude. "They're expecting us," Jon shouted. Daenerys signaled that they should swing around to flank the fortress. Drogon belched a jet of flame, cutting through the swirling snow, but the White Walkers dispersed, splitting apart so the fire hissed harmlessly on the ice. Rhaegal circled, letting out a roar that reverberated across the frozen sea. Yara's heart hammered. This was no simple infiltration. It was an open confrontation. The plan had always been risky: sneak in, sabotage the fortress. But there would be no surprise if the Night King and his lieutenants were already arrayed for battle. "We have to land," she screamed into Jon's ear. "We can't fight them midair like this." Jon grimaced. "We'll try the far side of the fortress, see if we can breach it from within." He guided Rhaegal in a wide arc. Drogon followed. Lightning flickered again. Below, shapes scuttled from the fortress's base. An army of whites, thousands strong, already forming ranks across the ice. The sight made Yara's blood run colder than ever. This was the horde she had once tried to guide. Now it barred her path. "There's no way through," Grey Worm shouted from Drogon's back. "They block every approach." Daenerys surveyed the terrain, her face a mask of iron determination. "Then we'll make one." She urged Drogon to descend, jaws parted, and unleashed a torrent of dragonfire that lit the ice with a blinding glare. The storm hissed and shrieked, superheated steam rising as the flame scorched the White Walkers' ranks. The whites shriveled where the fire touched them, but more surged forward, climbing over the charred remains. Some of the White Walkers retreated, but a handful stood firm, raising their weapons. One hurled an ice spear. Drogon twisted mid-flight, avoiding the projectile by inches. It shattered on the ice below, sending shards into the milling dead. Rhaegal roared in response, diving lower to support Drogon. Jon clutched the reins with white-knuckled hands, maneuvering so Yara had a clearer view. She spotted a potential gap where the fortress wall curved inward, partially sheltered by spires. "There!" she shouted, pointing. "Land us in that alcove. Maybe we can slip inside." Jon nodded, guiding Regal. Another spear whistled by, missing them by mere feet. The wind roared, almost drowning out the dragon's own cries. Daenerys, seeing Jon's move, directed Drogon to breathe fire again on the nearest White Walkers, scattering them and clearing a path. The moment the flames died, Regal landed in a spray of cracked ice. Yara nearly fell off from the sudden impact, her wounded side screaming. She forced herself upright. The fortress wall loomed overhead, stretching into swirling darkness. Jon slid off the saddle, dragging his sword. He'd had it reforged from the shards of House Mormont's Valyrian steel, or so rumor said. Yara dismounted shakily, drawing a long dragonglass dagger. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one crystallizing in the air. Inside, Jon urged. They sprinted across jagged ice toward a yawning tunnel in the fortress wall, likely some side entrance used by the White Walkers. It was wide enough for 2 men abreast. Behind them, Drogon landed heavily, letting Grey Worm and Daenerys jump down. She wasted no time, sending Drogon aloft again to cover them with more flame, hoping to prevent the Whites from swarming the entrance. Yara led the way into the tunnel, her nerves taut. She recognized the swirling patterns in the ice, the same runic shapes she had glimpsed before. The corridor sloped downward, lit by an eerie glow. The temperature dropped with each step, until it felt as though the very air had turned to knives. She heard only the crunch of footsteps on the frozen floor. No wind, no dripping water, just an unholy silence, broken by their ragged breathing. Grey Worm took point, spear at the ready. Jon walked beside him, sword raised, Daenerys behind them with a dragonglass-dipped staff she had taken from Grey Worm's supply. Yara brought up the rear, her heart pounding. She could feel the fortress's malevolence pressing down, as though the walls themselves bristled with living hatred. Now and again, she thought she saw flickers in the ice, warped reflections of her face, or maybe the faces of dead men. She clutched her dagger tighter, willing her legs not to buckle. They emerged into a large antechamber lit by that same ghostly radiance. It reminded Yara of the vast cathedral-like space where she had first beheld the Night King. Pillars of dark ice stretched to a domed ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was polished to a mirror sheen, so reflective that she felt dizzy, as though she might fall into an inverted world. At the far end, an archway opened onto blackness. Grey Worm signaled for silence. The 4 advanced, footsteps echoing. A frigid wind seemed to swirl around them, though no visible source existed. Yara recognized the layout, though it seemed to shift in her memory. "It's beyond that arch," she whispered, recalling the downward spiral to the central cavern with the magical pool. "That's where he draws his power." Jon nodded. "Then let's destroy it if we can." His breath plumed white. "Dragonglass might work, or dragonfire, if Daenerys can get the dragons inside." Daenerys's lips curled into a grim smile. "I'll see about that if we clear a path." They moved forward as one, each step feeling heavier. The cold gnawed at Yara's wound, making her vision blur. She forced herself to remain upright. Just a few more steps. Through the archway, they descended a winding corridor that coiled like a serpent. The swirling patterns in the ice grew more elaborate, sometimes resembling monstrous faces or frozen beasts. She thought she glimpsed a kraken embedded in the wall, its tentacles writhing. The illusions teased her eyes, threatening to sap her courage. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. A White Walker, taller than a normal man, skin a pale, shimmering blue, carrying an ice spear. His gaze flared with cold light. In an instant, Grey Worm lunged. His steel-tipped spear met the White Walker's weapon with a shattering impact. Shards of ice fell. Jon sprang forward, swinging his Valyrian blade, and the White Walker barely deflected it. A shriek of grinding ice filled the corridor. Daenerys thrust her dragonglass-tipped staff, aiming for the walker's heart, twisted aside, moving with supernatural grace. Yara dashed forward, dagger raised, hoping to catch it off guard. The walker pivoted, slashing at her with the spear's butt. She ducked, the blow whistling over her head. Grey Worm pressed in again, forcing the walker to guard its flank. It stumbled on the uneven floor. Jon seized that moment and drove his Valyrian blade clean through its chest. A strangled gasp left its icy lips. Then the walker collapsed in a burst of frozen shards, scattering across the floor like broken glass. They barely had time to exhale before more shapes materialized at the corridor's end. 2 additional White Walkers. One carried a sword of ice, the other a spear. Yara's stomach clenched. "Run!" she rasped. "No time to fight them all. We have to destroy the source." The group broke into a charge, ignoring the searing cold. The White Walkers advanced, their eyes blazing. Grey Worm feinted left, distracting one, while Jon faced the other. Daenerys brandished her staff, but as she stepped forward to help Jon, a gust of frost-laden wind roared through the corridor, knocking her back. She slammed against the icy wall with a cry. Yara caught a glimpse of movement, another White Walker emerging behind them. Panic surged. They were outnumbered. "Go!" Jon shouted to Yara. "Find the source. End this." "But..." He batted aside an ice sword, panting. "Go!" She locked eyes with Daenerys, who gave a quick nod, pressing a hand to her side, winded but still conscious. Grey Worm roared a battle cry, hurling his spear at one of the walkers. It pierced the creature's shoulder, and a shriek echoed through the corridor. Yara forced her feet to move, sprinting down the passageway that spiraled deeper, the sound of steel and ice clashing behind her. Every step down that winding path felt like an eternity. Her lungs burned. The fortress seemed to tilt, as if shifting around her. She clutched the dagger, knuckles white. At last, the corridor opened onto a broad cavern. A faint glow pulsed from the center. The same black pool she remembered, roiling gently with a supernatural luminescence. Steam or vapor curled above its surface. Her heart lurched. This was the source of the Night King's freezing magic, the place where he'd bound her blood to his will. If she could destroy it somehow, maybe the seas would crack, maybe her men would be freed. The chamber was silent, except for her ragged breathing. She stepped forward, scanning for threats. The ice columns rose overhead, forming a vault. At the center of the pool, a slender spire of ice jutted upward, shaped almost like a needle. Dark shapes writhed beneath the water's surface. Frozen nightmares or illusions, she couldn't tell. She approached the edge, remembering how the Night King had demonstrated his control, freezing and unfreezing it with a touch. With trembling hands, she knelt, placing her palm against the glassy surface. The cold nearly fused her skin to the ice. She closed her eyes, feeling that bond swirl inside her. It recognized this place. Her chest constricted, as if the fortress itself reached out to draw her in, whispering that she was no traitor, that she belonged here. A wave of dizziness overwhelmed her. Tears stung her eyes. She remembered her father, Balon Greyjoy, who had taught her to be ruthless, cunning. She remembered Theon as a boy, bright-eyed despite his father's scorn. She remembered the Iron Islands battered by storms, the salt in her hair, the taste of sea spray. She remembered the Night King's promise of dominion and immortality for her people, a promise that had lured her. Now the illusions parted, and she saw the truth. An endless night that devoured everything she loved, including the sea itself. She bit down on her lip, drawing blood, forcing clarity. She drew out a small pouch from her cloak, dragonglass dust, given by Daenerys for sabotage. It was meant to be poured into the source of the magic. The Maesters had once speculated that dragonglass, combined with certain runic wards, might disrupt the White Walker's hold on the living. She had no idea if it would work, but it was all she had. Her hand shook as she tore the pouch open with her teeth, spitting out threads of burlap. She scattered the dark granules onto the pool's surface. Instantly, the water hissed and churned. A swirl of vapor rose, glowing with bluish light. The entire cavern rumbled, as if offended by this contamination. "Come on," she muttered, dredging up the last of her strength. She reached for the dagger at her belt, a shard of dragon steel hammered with obsidian edges. Steeling herself, she lifted it high and slammed it into the ice at the pool's edge. The blade bit deep, cracking the surface. "Break!" she hissed, pounding again with the hilt. She thought of Theon, of her men locked in chains of frost. "Break! Damn you!" The fissures spread, spiderwebbing across the ice. The pool roiled more violently. A thunderous crack echoed in the vaulted chamber. A surge of water erupted, half-freezing midair in jagged shapes. She stumbled back, nearly losing her footing. The dagger glowed with an eerie, flickering light where it stuck in the ice. She saw the obsidian dust swirl deeper into the pool, blackening parts of it. For a moment she dared to hope. Then a cold presence pressed against her back, so powerful it stole her breath. Slowly, she turned, dread coiling in her gut. The Night King stood at the chamber's threshold, tall and silent, eyes glowing with ancient malice. He wore armor of ice that radiated an impossible chill. In one hand he held a jagged spear. In the other he cradled the battered form of a man, dragging him by the collar. Her stomach lurched when she recognized the battered face beneath a mat of black hair. Jon Snow, still alive but barely, blood dribbling from his mouth. He must have fought his way free of the White Walkers above, only to be overpowered in the end. Their eyes locked. Jon tried to speak, but only a ragged cough escaped. The Night King tossed him to the ground, then glided forward, his gaze fixed on Yara. She saw the spear's tip, glittering with lethal frost. The entire chamber seemed to freeze again, the cracks in the ice halting as his magic opposed the sabotage. Her legs quaked. She felt his power pushing into her mind, punishing her betrayal. White-hot pain seared her veins, as though her blood turned to shards of ice. She buckled, falling to her knees with a strangled cry. The brand on her chest pulsed, agony rippling through every limb. The dagger clattered from her numb hand. She heard the water roiling behind her, sensed the fortress trying to repair itself. All her efforts undone in seconds by his presence. Through tear-blurred vision, she glimpsed Jon stirring on the floor, struggling to reach for a weapon. But he was too weak, battered from the fight above. The Night King took another step closer, raising the spear, ready to impale her. In that moment, she thought of Theon, of the promise she'd made to protect the Iron Islands, to never kneel. Summoning every ounce of will, she lurched forward, grabbing hold of the spear's haft with both hands. Ice burned her palms, but she refused to let go. The Night King's eyes blazed. He twisted the spear, sending a wave of freezing magic coursing through her arms. Her vision dimmed, darkness creeping at the edges. But she clung on. Behind him, Jon crawled closer, his breath wheezing. The Night King seemed oblivious, focused on finishing Yara. She coughed blood, her lips numb. She saw Jon's hand close around the hilt of her fallen dagger, the dragonsteel one. He forced himself upright with a wounded groan, raising it high. The Night King sensed him at the last second, whirling, but Yara yanked the spear, trying to hold him in place. Pain flared, but she refused to yield. Jon drove the dagger into the Night King's back with every last shred of strength. A shriek like a winter gale erupted, and cracks of brilliant blue light spiderwebbed across the Night King's armor. He staggered, dropping the spear. Yara fell away, sobbing with relief. The dagger's dragonglass edges tore through his icy flesh. He reached for Jon in fury, but the damage was done. His core splintered, fracturing like fragile crystal. His form wavered, the unnatural glow in his eyes flickering. Jon jerked the dagger free and stabbed again. A roar of wind and frost blasted them. The Night King collapsed, dissolving into shards of ice that clattered across the cavern floor. Instantly, the entire fortress groaned, and the pool behind them erupted once more, releasing a fountain of frigid water. Thunderous cracks echoed as ice shattered overhead. Yara curled into a ball, arms over her head, as chunks of black ice rained down. When she looked up, the Night King was gone, reduced to a swirl of frozen shards. Jon sagged, drenched in icy slush, half-conscious. She crawled over to him, helping support his weight. The brand on her chest felt different now, no longer a source of agony, but a numb ache. She sensed that the bond had broken, that the power saturating the fortress had been disrupted. Would that free her men? She prayed it would. A tremor ran through the entire cavern. The pool's black waters boiled, losing their ghostly glow. The swirling illusions in the ice flickered and died. She realized with a jolt that the fortress might collapse. "We have to go," she rasped. "Now." Jon nodded weakly, letting her guide him toward the corridor. The walls trembled, raining shards. Icy spires cracked apart. She half-dragged him up the spiral, each step an agony in her battered side. They reached the antechamber, where chunks of ceiling fell in thunderous crashes. Another White Walker awaited them, but it lurched and collapsed mid-lunge, as if the death of the Night King had stripped it of life. It shattered on impact with the floor. Yara and Jon raced on. At last, they emerged at the fortress's outer gate. Through the swirling storm, she saw Daenerys and Grey Worm at a distance, hacking at a final White Walker that had not yet fallen. As she watched, it too jerked, froze, and collapsed. Grey Worm stumbled back, panting. The entire fortress behind them shook like a wounded beast, black ice spires toppling. Daenerys spotted Jon and Yara and sprinted over, relief etched on her features. "The Night King?" she demanded. "Is he?" Jon nodded, eyes glassy. "Dead." For a moment, Daenerys simply stared in wonder. Then she seized Yara's arm, gripping it tight. "You did it," she breathed. Yara almost laughed. "Jon did it," she said. "He stabbed him. I just held on." Her legs threatened to buckle, but Daenerys and Grey Worm kept her upright. The crash of ice was deafening now. Sheets of frozen walls peeled away in massive slabs, plunging into the swirling ocean. Yara felt the ground tilt, as though the entire fortress was caving in on itself. "Dragons!" Grey Worm barked, pointing. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, letting out agitated cries. Already, parts of the courtyard had collapsed into a crevasse, revealing black water beneath. Daenerys whistled sharply. Drogon descended, smashing aside a crumbling tower with his tail. Rhaegal followed, landing in a swirl of snow and ice shards. Yara clung to Jon, half carrying him to Rhaegal's side. Grey Worm helped Daenerys mount Drogon. Then, with a mighty heave, Yara and Jon hoisted themselves into Rhaegal's saddle. The dragon roared, launching skyward just as the ground crumbled beneath them. Below, the fortress shattered inwards, spires toppling in great cascades of black ice. Huge slabs crashed into the sea, sending up geysers of foaming water. The swirling storms that had cloaked the fortress began to disperse, leaving the sky clearer, if still dark and cold. Yara clutched at Jon, who was barely conscious, his body limp from injuries. She shouted to Rhaegal, though she had no idea how to command a dragon. The beast's own instincts took over, carrying them to safety. Moments later, Drogon ascended. Daenerys and Grey Worm perched upon him, battered but alive. They circled once, gazing at the ruin below. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, both dragons turned south, away from the collapsing fortress. Yara felt tears sting her eyes. She had never believed she would see that place destroyed. But if the stories were right, if the Night King truly commanded all White Walkers and Whites, then with his end came the collapse of his armies. Her battered heart dared to hope that the seas might thaw, that her men might be free from the curse. She also thought of all those who had perished, her own fault in part for forging that alliance in the first place. Let the realm remember that Yara Greyjoy was complicit in the freezing of the seas. Whatever came next, she would face it with open eyes. For now, she leaned over Jon, pressing a hand to his cheek. He shivered, but he was breathing. She had no words. The dragons flew on, heading south to a future where, perhaps, the living had another chance. where the Iron Islands might not remain locked in ice, where she might yet atone for the path she had chosen. The wind still howled, the cold still bit, but the hush of endless winter no longer seemed unstoppable. With the fortress destroyed and the Night King gone, a new dawn might break. She glanced at the horizon, where a faint glimmer of light pressed against the night sky. It was as fragile as a single candle flame in a void, but it was there. She closed her eyes, letting the wind carry them away from the tomb of black ice. Whatever fate awaited her back in the broken kingdoms of Westeros, she would meet it as Yara Greyjoy, scarred, battered, but unbowed. The hush of winter had lost its king, and now the living might find their voices once more.